In this presentation, I'm going to take you through an introduction to a range of different types of translation technology. These will include machine translation, computer-assisted translation, and a number of others. However, we're going to start with a brief look at human translation. Let's look at a definition of human translation. I guess this is kind of obvious, but human translation may be defined as translation by humans who are fluent in the source language and, normally, native speakers of the target language. Note that normally, because in some circumstances and indeed in some countries, it is acceptable for translators to work out of their native language. This is a reasonable definition, although in the context of translation technology, it's a little bit dated for the reason that these days just about all translation work involves the use of some type of computer-based technology, even if that is just the humble word processor. Human translation, where the agency of the human translator is paramount and it's not perhaps significantly supported by the use of computer programs, is used generally for the translation of what might be called sensitive documents, where the wording, the precise wording, is crucial. And also documents that do not include a large amount of repeated material, or documents that are unlikely to be frequently revised. The reason for this will become clear as we go through the presentation. Moving on from that, you're all familiar with the concept of machine translation. Now, machine translation can be defined as translation that is performed wholly or partly by a computer program. And this or partly bit comes as a bit of a surprise to some people maybe, who are used to using Google Translate. You just put a text in, you press a button and another text comes out. The partly bit refers to the fact that in the real world, when you're using machine translation, the text is sometimes pre-processed, but more frequently it will be post-edited. In other words, it will be tidied up or repaired before it's sent on to the client, or before it can be judged to be ready to be presented to whoever is going to be reading it. Okay. As a general rule, there is little human intervention during the translation process itself, however. That, as I've said, takes place either before or, more commonly, after the translation has been completed. That might be in the process of changing, however. So, machine translation is used in a range of different areas, and those would include, the type that you're probably familiar with to get the gist of web pages or other documents with which you're unfamiliar because they're written in a language you don't understand. However, machine translation is also useful for translating large volumes of data and possibly only producing a rough draft translation, which is of an acceptable quality, good enough for people to read and understand it, even if it's not finalized and polished. This is being used. This approach is being used on company websites to give audiences access to, for example, a knowledge base which is written in one language, typically English. Machine translation, as I suggested, is also used for producing a draft translation which will then be post-edited. It's now being increasingly used for mobile translation, translation while on the move, to understand a menu or something like that, and also now it's being used in real contexts by people not generally associated with the translation industry for speech-to-speech translation. So I've posted some ideas for contemporary examples of machine translation that have been developed or are currently still being developed. The first of these was a mobile app. It's now incorporated into Google Translate. And then the second involves a demonstration of Microsoft's English-Chinese voice translation. And then the third, the pilot, this comes from a promotional, this is a promotional clip showing how a translator that fits into your ear can handle real speech. So if you'd like to pause your player or come back to these later to have a look, here are the URLs where you can view them in the tiny URL format, which means if you need to type them, which I think you may do, you don't have to type an extremely long web address. Okay, going on now. So we've talked briefly about human translation and machine translation. Now, residing somewhere between those two concepts is that of computer-aided or computer-assisted translation. And this can be defined as the use of software to help human translators with specific aspects of the translation process. Now, with computer-aided translation, you do not get the computer or computer programs to do the translation for you. You remain in control, and it is your translation. And as the definition implies, you use different types of software application to help you with different aspects of the translation process. Now, translation memory, which I'll be talking about presently, forms a major part of computer-aided translation. So where's this used? I referred briefly a few minutes ago to material that did not go through repeated revision or did not contain large amounts of repeated material. That was for human translation. So computer-aided translation, and in particular translation memory, is used for the opposite case, where you're translating material that does have a high level of repetition, or material that is likely to be revised and updated on an ongoing basis. The other point to make, and I've been trying to make this in the course so far, is that using computer-aided translation, or CAT as it's sometimes referred to, or other applications such as terminology management, you can in fact capture your terminology or indeed your translations. And once it's captured, it can be recycled in a number of fairly interesting ways. So I was privileged enough a few years ago to hear a presentation from Will Burgett, who's a senior executive of the Intel organization. And he was talking about the need for translation. Now, you often hear people saying that translators are going to be made redundant by the advance of technology. Now, this is not really the case. There will always, or for a good time to come, be the need for translators to work on sensitive texts of the type I was describing earlier on. But on the other hand, there is now machine translation, which is being implemented and deployed to translate large amounts of material which human translators simply don't have the time to get to, because one of the things that's happened over the last few years, as people's ability to produce text and content has escalated, so the amount of material which it would be useful to translate has also grown considerably. On the right-hand side of the screen, you see a screenshot of what was called the Worldwide Information Growth Ticker, and you used to be able to watch that growing in real time, but they've subsequently taken it down. But even back then, that was the number of bytes of information. 1 byte approximately is 1 letter, or you need 2 bytes to represent a Chinese character generally. So that's quite a lot of information. Unfortunately, I don't remember what the word for such a large number. There is technically a name for it. I'll have to check what that is. But it's a lot of information there. Now, the list on the left-hand side involves types of material which occur in increasing amounts. So with sales material, the idea is that the sales material attached to a particular product would be relatively restricted in scope, and so would generally be worked on by human translators. But by the time you get to the other end, to the bottom of this list, with knowledge bases and user-generated content, so a knowledge base such as appears on the Intel website for people who need to troubleshoot problems they might be having with Intel products. I've already mentioned that they use a machine translation solution to provide on-the-hoof translation, and they will use a targeted, tailor-made machine translation solution which is specifically designed to translate their content. And you see the same thing on some social media sites as well now, who've been developing their own translation tool which has been geared specifically to translate the types of thing that people say on social media sites. Moving on now, so those are the 3 main types of translation: human, machine, and computer-aided translation. But there are other types which I think we should also take account of, and one of them is localization, which is sometimes abbreviated as L10N, simply because there are 10 letters between the L and the N. Now, localization, here's a definition: it involves taking a product and making it linguistically and culturally appropriate to the target locale, which means the target country or region and language, where it will be used and sold. Okay? Now, in practice, this means web content, help files, games, software, and mobile apps. All of those, when they're moved into other languages, we tend to use the term localization rather than translation for various reasons. And if this course has been of particular interest to you, you may have noticed that in semester 2, there's going to be another course specifically in the area of localization that you might like to consider taking. Next, there is crowdsourcing. And this, to use a very standard definition, is the act of taking a job traditionally performed by a designated agent, such as an employee, and outsourcing it to an undefined, generally large group of people in the form of an open call. Crowdsourcing is generally performed free of charge by volunteers. Facebook used this approach in order to translate its own website, its interface. They invited people who enjoyed using their website and who knew more than one language to work on the translation themselves, and that is what happened. Crowdsourcing or crowdsourced translation takes place for charitable organizations, for example, and in emergency contexts as well. On social media, as I've mentioned, and then also in journals or other content that gets published unofficially. And I'm sure you're aware of the way in which many of the Harry Potter series of novels was first of all translated really, really quickly for the Chinese audience before the official translator appeared. That can be thought of as an example of crowdsourcing. Now we come to the question of translation memory. And in the first week, you may remember that I mentioned that we're going to be covering 2 translation memory tools in the course over the course. So that will be taking up about 5 weeks of the course. And indeed, much of your work in the team-based project, which is going to be happening over the last 3 weeks of the semester, will be involving also the use of translation memory. Okay, so I suppose before translation memory was invented, translators might have wished that certain tasks could be made easier, possibly by the use of computers. And these would include an increase in productivity. Translators always want to be able to translate or work faster, and never to, and therefore to earn more money more quickly. Then never to have to translate the same sentence twice, or indeed similar sentences. To have instant or easy access to ideas from previous translations and the possibility of reusing them quickly and easily. And to be able to receive extra help and suggestions from external sources within one single interface. And it's based ultimately on an idea which was verbalized by Pierre Isabelle and a few of his colleagues more than 25 years ago now, but the quote still remains relevant. And what he and his colleagues said, was that existing translations contain more solutions to more translation problems than any other available resource. And translation memory really exploits that idea, because it starts to use your old translations, or indeed someone else's old translations, as a resource that can be consulted and exploited. So a translation memory, abbreviated as TM usually, is a bilingual database consisting of sentences in the source and target languages which are aligned or lined up with each other, which means if you access material from a sentence in English, you can also automatically also have access to the translation of that sentence. A TM tool will suggest matches which may be perfect or fuzzy for new sentences that are being translated on the basis of material that has already been translated. Now you can build up your own translation memory, but it's also possible to share translation memories across teams, or indeed sometimes to download translations that have been, translation memories that have been made publicly available. With TM, the translator is always in control, even if these days the fashion is now to combine it with machine translation, but the machine translation takes place within the TM interface, and it's part of the process, and the translator, as I said, remains very much in control on a sentence-by-sentence basis. Now, given this, you have to bear in mind that since translation memory involves recycling old material, the translations that come about as a result of its use will only be as good as the translations being recycled. What will a translation memory database do? So what it does, it stores each sentence plus its translation as it's translated. It goes without saying that it will only work with material that's available in an electronic format. It will automatically suggest the old translation where the same sentence or maybe a similar sentence recurs. When you start using TM, the translation memory itself is empty. But as you translate, it fills up. Now, if you manage to translate 2,000 words a day, which is sort of what what full-time translators will be aiming for, 2,000 words would equate to round about 100 sentences. So by the end of the first day, your TM would have grown to include 100 segments. By the end of the first month, you will have, assuming you've been translating for 20 days in that month, which is not unreasonable, you'll have 2,000 segments, and so it goes on. So it grows quite rapidly, and the bigger it gets, of course, the more useful it becomes. Now, there is another term, personally I don't use it very much, and that is translation environment tools, known as TENTs, generally for short. And a translation environment tool will combine the following facilities. First of all, a text editor. Okay, somewhere for you to type and edit your translation. Secondly, a number of filters that will allow you to translate material that exists in different formats, such as a PowerPoint presentation, a Word document, an Excel spreadsheet, a web page, and so on. The text editor will be able to handle them all with equal ease. Most importantly, it will contain a translation memory. And then it will have a terminology module, and typically, each time you move on to a new sentence or segment, it will look up and present to you all the terms that it finds. It will also offer you the possibility of aligning your old translations. Now, I mentioned about the term TENTs. You will hear that term increasingly these days, particularly in some circles, but many people continue to refer to these systems by the rather older term, which is translation memory system, and probably you'll hear me using that term as well myself. This is simply a list of some quite well-known translation memory systems, and the ones that we're going to be focusing on, as I said, are SDL Trados Studio and MemSource. This is a screenshot of a typical translation memory tool. As a matter of fact, it's not one of the ones we're going to be focusing on, but it shows you what one of these tools looks like. So on the left-hand side, you have the source text, which has been divided into sentences or segments. And as you translate, you type your translation in on the right-hand side. And when you finish a sentence, as soon as you're happy with it, you mark it as translated and move on to the next one. On the right-hand side, we have a hit from the translation memory. And then also there would be a space for terms, any terms that have been recognized to be displayed. In fact, we do have a term here. We have 2 hits from the translation memory, and we also have a term from the term base. And these numbers here, they represent shortcuts. So if you want to paste the first one in, you press Control 1. If you wanted to paste the term in, you'd press Control 3, and so on. One thing we're also going to be covering in the course is subtitling software. We're going to be spending some time during a session later on in the course using an online subtitler. And one of these will enable you to type the text in for the subtitles, format and position the subtitles, to set the start and end times with great precision. That's very important. And of course, preview the subtitles prior to publishing them or downloading them. We are also going to be spending a bit of time on what's called terminology extraction. Up to now, we've been searching for terms on the web. However, there are systems that you can use which will attempt to identify words and phrases within a text or a set of texts that are being used in a terminological sense. And you get presented with them, and of course, as the human user, you will need to decide which are indeed terms and need to be researched and ultimately added to your term base. All of these systems can be described as computer-assisted translation. They don't, generally speaking, involve machine translation, although MT is, as I said, sometimes now being implemented within the context of translation memory systems. But the thing to remember is that the translator, when using CAT tools or translation memory tools, is the person who is overall responsible for the shape of the translation in a way that perhaps does not really work when you're just using machine translation. And the other thing to remember, as I said, is that the main component of these tools, whatever you might call them translation memory tools, you might call them CAT tools, or you might call them TENS, but whatever you call them, the main component is the translation memory. The whole point of translation technology is to automate the translation process, and this is possible in a number of different ways. Machine translation, of course, provides instant automation, whereas the use of translation memory provides an increasing or a constantly increasing level of automation. The larger the TM gets, the more useful it becomes. When you combine the two, you're using TM to translate the content that is already known, and then machine translation to produce a draft of the rest of the text, which isn't perhaps contained in the TM. Now, this process, which does allow you to translate, or frequently allows you to translate a lot faster, will generate a large amount of data through the use of the MT and the TM, and this can then be used to produce, ultimately, a custom-built machine translation system that will specialize in the type of text that you have been translating. So while I've been at pains to keep these two types of translation technology, machine translation and translation memory, separate throughout this presentation, it is important to remember that they are in fact gradually converging. Thank you very much for your attention.